I say this in, again, a lyrical way, but exactly that sentiment, that the safest bets you place in life are the ones you place on yourself, because you'll never be a greater expert on you than you. So always bet on yourself. So I agree. We are our own worst critic, but we're also our own best teacher when we sort of calibrate it correctly.
Hey guys, check out the 2023 Street Cop Conference, April 23rd through the 28th, Gaylord Convention Center. It's going to be the event of the year. Keynote speakers include Rob O'Neill, the guy who killed bin Laden, Kyle Carpenter, the youngest living Medal of Honor recipient, Navy SEAL Jason Redmond, Fox News host Tommy Lahren, Marine Corps Special Forces and Leadership Coach Cody Alford, Sheriff Wayne Ivey, Sheriff David Clark, and Sheriff Mark Lamb. It's going to be one hell of an event. And on top of that, we have all of our instructors and additional instructors from other companies going to be at the event, giving you everything they know for you to have a successful career and get the results you want to get in the field as a police officer. On top of attending the event, you'll get face-to-face time with every instructor attending the event, and all the keynote speakers will spend time with you. We got special events all week, giveaways, nightlife. It's going to be really, really worth your time, energy, and effort. I promise you, you will not regret it for a second. To register for the conference, check out streetcop.com, click conference, and everything you need will be there on the homepage. If you are looking for a room, just click book a room. The block has been sold out at the Gaylord Opryland Convention Center, but there are many hotels nearby within a walking distance of the event. You don't want to miss out on this opportunity. We will see you there.
111, 110.
You training to be a street cop?
Hey guys, welcome to this episode of the Street Cop Training Podcast. I'm your host, founder, and CEO of Street Cop Training. My name is Dennis Benino, and boy, big guest today. I don't even know where to start.
You come a long way. You've done good.
Yeah, we made it. We made it. Matt Higgins is here. If you're unfamiliar with Matt, because we're doing this crossover from the business world into the street cop world, a lot of people are going to be excited to hear from him. Matt was a guest host on, guest shark on Shark Tank. And good episode, by the way. Really good episode. But also, I mean, literally has done 1,000 things with the world, his life. Really cool fucking story. A lot of good shit can come out of this. And we're excited to have you here today, man. I can't thank you enough for making time to do this for the men and women in blue around the country. And, whoever else listens to this shit.
No, thanks for having me. It's like a way for me to say thank you, like en masse, without stopping somebody on a street corner, be like, hey, thank you. And now I can do it to thousands of cops at the same time. So, hey, thank you.
It's awesome, man. I was actually at Yankee Stadium yesterday. You could tell by the red face that I have from the sunburn. I got stuck in the fucking sun. And I probably said thank you to about 38 cops that I could find. And for some odd reason, the NYPD.
You know what's nice these days, too? When you say it, it means a lot more, because I think less people say it, right? And even less people mean it.
I think these men and women in New York are beat up pretty bad. And I think that, oddly enough, they probably hear it more now than ever, because people have really felt a lot of compassion for the police with the recent events in this country's history.
Well, that's awesome. I mean, for those, maybe a little bit of background, so that
please.
So I not only, we can get into my company and Shark Tank, but before all that, I'm a lifelong New Yorker, and I grew up in Queens, New York. And we can also get into my biographical background, but I was press secretary to the mayor of New York, Giuliani, back on September 11th. And then I was one of the first employees, if not the first employee, of the rebuilding of the World Trade Center site from a federal agency called Lower Manhattan Development Corps. We had a $2 billion budget. So I was there, within an hour after the first plane struck, and I didn't leave for 2 years until we had a design for the site. So I've had my experience with government, been fortunate to be around cops my entire career, mostly getting picked on as a little kid when I used to call me Doogie Howser, because I was like 12 years old when I was press secretary.
It's funny. I bring up at the end of the program that I teach, there's a video, and it's a dash cam footage of a Maryland state trooper who pulls over one of the 9/11 hijackers. I don't know if you know this. 2 days before he flew one of the planes into the Twin Towers, killing thousands of people. And I'm going to allude to what the point I was going to get to, but the point I make about that to start is this is the importance of the work that we do. We were this close, just that close, but this guy didn't have the training, I'm guessing. I've read the articles about it. He wrote him the ticket, cut him loose. And there were probably 75 red flags that went up on that traffic stop that if he'd been trained to see those things, it may have been different. But we know what happened. And that's one side of it. But I remember I was 19 years old. I was delivering pizza. It was actually right before I went to police academy, and watching the towers fall. So I try to explain this to the people in the country, other police officers, especially a younger generation. They don't have context of what it was like to feel 9/11 when it occurred, and how many people that we all knew personally that perished in that, friends' fathers, friends' mothers, friends. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit on what that felt like to be at Ground Zero 9/11 to give context.
Yeah. So to rewind, that was actually election day in New York City was the primary. And by that point, Giuliani, had gone through different cycles, right? We had reduced crime from 3,200 homicides, somewhere in that range under Higgins, to around 600, I believe. Welfare rolls had gone from 1.1 million down to 700,000. So the city had been revitalized, become livable, but everybody was also tired as they become a politician. So, everyone was ready for Giuliani to leave. And so that was the context. And I was heading to meet him for a photo op to vote. And then driving through the highway, all these sirens light up all around me. And you realize obviously something as catastrophic has happened. And then I raced to City Hall, and the Giuliani's rule about crisis, which I've taken with me throughout my life, was number one rule of crisis management is to show up and to let people know that you're in charge. And you do that physically, but you also do that symbolically. So when I went to the site, my job was to set up a press conference outside the towers. And so I was on Church and Park Place, for those who understand Lower Manhattan. So it's pretty close. And, everyone's being evacuated, and I'm there setting up because you didn't have context, right? Like when you looked up at the Trade Center in those early minutes, people assumed it was a Cessna that hit. So it was definitely, the fog of war. And as time went by, I was like, this just doesn't make sense. This isn't safe. And I remember I couldn't get the mayor on a cell phone, and it was a payphone across the street. Youngins who are listening, those were little boxes where you'd call people back in the day, but there was a payphone, and I'm trying to call the mayor. I couldn't get him either. And so I was like, let me go back to City Hall and see how do I find him? Where is he? Now he was located a block away in a makeshift command center. I go back to City Hall, and as I'm about to approach the gates, I hear the most extraordinary explosion. And you have no context. And I assume that the subway has been blown up, because I look down Broadway and I see this cloud of rolling like thunder and concrete heading, and people are just running. And at that moment, everybody surged against the City Hall gate. And there was a cop at the gate with this look of, panic, like, what do I do? And I was like, open the gate. And this crush of humanity fled into the City Hall Plaza. And I remember running through the plaza, and the cloud caught up to us, and I thought it was like sarin gas, or that this was it. And I breathed it all in, and I start choking and gagging, like, holy fuck, like this is it. And everybody dropped to your knees, and then 10 seconds later, you're like, well, I'm not dead, so let's keep running. So we kept running, and I started making my way up north, again, not knowing where the mayor is, and wondering, did everybody just die in a secondary attack? And I remember going to a diner and saying, let me get your phone. I call Henry Stern, the Parks Commissioner. I said, where can we make a temporary command center? I never told this story. And he tells me there's an armory on Houston Street. Let's meet up there. So again, just thinking, I don't know who's around and who's left. And so I start walking up north. 2 blocks over, the mayor's walking up north. And that famous video that you see of him saying, we got to get there. So I finally figure out where they're going. They're going to a firehouse. And I'll never forget these images. They go into the firehouse, and you look around the walls, and you don't normally see a firehouse completely empty of all the equipment. And I realized, where did everybody go? They raced to the building that just collapsed. And Tommy Von Essen, who's the fire commissioner, was sitting on the floor, and he's sobbing with his head in his hands. And then I started to realize, wait, he realizes that everybody in this firehouse, most of them could be dead right now. And in the adjacent office, the mayor's on the phone with the vice president screaming, we need air cover. Because again, we think that City Hall, that New York is being attacked, with bombs or jets. Like, again, fog of war. And so within an hour, we had identified a place to do a makeshift command center. So if anybody's seen the videos, the early videos of the press conferences, you'll see like the back of an auditorium and a clock. And it's because we were told by the FBI to conceal your location as you start doing press conferences. And so we did that. We reversed the auditorium because it was the police academy, training academy, and there was a big life-size mural that said "To protect and serve." It was like, well, that's not going to work. Even the terrorists know what that means. And so we did, and that's when the mayor said, somebody asked about the fatalities, and he said it would be more than any one of us could bear. And so that was the beginning of me, like every day and night, running the command center with the mayor. My job quickly pivoted from briefings and going to the wreckage to building support for the retaliation, which, as you can imagine, I was pretty motivated for. So I stayed up for days. I brought President Bush's advance team to the site to figure out where we're going to go. I found the equipment of where I was standing. This is so crazy. I'm walking around with the Secret Service, and I'm like, we're not far from where I was. And it was about 100 feet away. I found the equipment in the box and had been crushed by yeah. And so this is also a little nutty, but you can understand when you've been through trauma. I carried that box with me first in my car and then around for 7 years until the museum was ready to take it. It's now in the museum. Of course, I got testicular cancer a few years later, but it's a whole nother story. But so anyway, just to give you a sense of it, the most important takeaway is just like, can you imagine, like, everything is just foggy, like what's going on? But I will say Giuliani did an incredible job. Like within days, we had commandeered a Pier 52, I think. And that's what we turned into our command center. Every federal agency, it was in the middle. And then in the back, we had a press conference. And on the back of the pier, every emir, president, prime minister of every country would pull up with their machine guns and their boats, and we would take them to ground zero so they could witness it themselves. Again, building support for the war. So I took Vladimir Putin there. I took the emir of Qatar, the president of Mexico. It's funny, you realize what everybody's role is in an international war on terror, during those 3 months. And so, but again, painting a picture I had to do the same thing for my children who weren't born that yet, trying to explain, what was it like? And then I spent 2 years overlooking the site. I moved my apartment overlooking ground zero. And then I moved my office overlooking ground zero. And I looked at it for 2 years straight. First, the inferno, and then the recovery, and then the early days of the rebuilding.
What are some of the traumas that you continue to carry from that experience?
That's a great question. So I didn't tell this little part of the story, but when I was trying to get down to, again, not understanding the enormity of it, I was trying to drive my car down to City Hall and couldn't get through the traffic on Broadway. So I jumped out of the car, and I had my sirens and one package and whatnot, but I left the car. I jumped onto the subway. The subway closed the doors, started moving a little bit, and then stopped.
Oh, shit.
And then I just had an absolute panic attack. Like, I get the fuck off this. Like, how do I get the, you know what I mean? Like, because again, this was the worst idea. It opened up for like a second. I fled out. To this day, I have absolute panic attacks anytime I'm on a subway and it goes through the tunnel, to the point now that I generally cannot drive. I can't take the train, through the Hudson River. Like, it's just too traumatizing. So I avoid it at all costs. I always go to the back car because I figure a terrorist isn't going to blow up the back. They're going to blow up the middle. And I also want to be able to jump out the back. So that's probably the biggest, to be honest. And I've tried to deal with that, but I decided rather than try to deal with it, just work around it.
After going through 9/11, obviously, as we progress into 2023 and the new world of putting mental health at a forefront, have you ever actually sought any kind of professional help to cope with what you went through on 9/11?
Yeah, I mean, 9/11, yeah, but 9/11 was like the tail end of a life of trauma. I mean, I grew up in dirt poverty. Anyone out there who has been forced to be a caregiver at a young age can relate to this, but my mother was disabled. Parents got divorced early age. And so it was on me to take care of everyone. So I was selling flowers on street corners at age 10 and working at McDonald's, scraping bubble gum underneath tables, and just like everything to stay alive. The house was dirty. Everything was dysfunctional, and everything was covered up and concealed, So if you looked at me, you'd think this kid came from a wealthy family, not wealthy family, wrong, but middle class, right? And so I dropped out of high school when I was 16 years old to get a GED so I could go to college early, which is crazy unto itself. But that's how I escaped out of poverty. I went to college, got my GED, started at 16. And then by the time I was 26, I went from scraping gum and selling flowers on street corners to the press secretary to the mayor of New York, right? So a lot of progress in a short period of time. But the consequence, though, was this endless hypervigilance, this boogeyman constantly, running to get me that never quite got away. If I'm honest, still hasn't quite, as absurd as that sounds, given what I've achieved, hasn't fully gone away. So the therapy that I have sought is to try to shrink that amygdala that's been like flashing like a cantaloupe, like size of a cantaloupe flashing like a siren, ever since I was a kid. And then 9/11, some of that therapy was about dealing with 9/11. But I have to say that 9/11 came at the end. My mother had died a few months earlier, and I remember when the attack happened. To be perfectly honest, I felt like this is where I belonged. I went back down to the site at 3:00 that afternoon with some guys from OEM, Office of Emergency Management. We were delusional to think we were going to go back into there to get important equipment. The building collapsed like 2 hours later or whatever. But like, for me, it felt perfectly natural. And I remember in that firehouse I was just telling you about, this is when I sought therapy a few months later. Somebody was passing around one of these early beepers, where you could type it out so that we could text everybody to tell them that we were okay. And I passed it along saying, I have nobody to text. I don't really have anyone to tell. And I remember my brother called me 3 days later, crying, like, what the fuck happened to you? How do you fucking not tell everybody that you're not dead? I was like, I don't know. It just didn't occur to me. Like, I didn't really feel like I had anybody to tell. So that was, months later, that's what caused me to say, hey, you have not dealt with the thing that happened before that. And then this tragedy happened. I think that's what happens sometimes when you're kind of in trauma, something bigger happens, and then you never get around to dealing with that initial trauma. That was more my situation.
Maybe even avoiding some of the trauma that you didn't want to deal with. And I think people don't realize is you can ignore this thing as much as you want to, these traumas in your life, but eventually you start to realize that really starts to have impact in your life and the progression of your life. And, I think a lot of us feel like we're indestructible. We feel like we don't feel what other people feel. We're built for things like this. You're resilient. You can handle this. But with that being said, and I've been very open and honest about things that I've gone through in some sense, what was the moment when you realized like, fuck, dude, I got to get some of this shit worked out?
Well, first of all, 100% agree with you. I mean, a lot of people who are listening to this can also relate. Like when you develop your sense of self based upon this idea that you can handle anything, and in a lot of ways you can. I think part of the consolation prize of trauma is that, you have a higher threshold for pain. So I had been to plane crashes, every kind of shooting. I mean, you can imagine working for the mayor of New York as his press secretary 24 hours a day, every weekend. And so I prided myself on the ability to deal with everything, but it wasn't 9/11 really. And it wasn't even cancer. I had testicular cancer when I was 32. I had a 3-month-old boy. You getting your testicle amputated. It's not a good day, right? Like even that didn't bring me to my knees. I went and got a dog tag made 2 days later. It said half the balls, twice the man, which I still wear. but what actually brought me to my knees was going through divorce and going through the trauma of that and realizing that, you can hide a lot of things in life, right? You can hide your pain, you can drown your pain, but like when your family breaks down, you really can't conceal that, right? And it was so humbling for a few reasons. I'd been a leader of people, right? And I had big teams. And because I had defined my self-worth by my ability to power through everything, I would always model that behavior to everybody else. And so back to my cancer story, I was running the New York Jets at the time running the business. And that's when I showed up to that dinner 2 days after having surgery, wearing the dog tag I just told you about right now. At the time, I thought that reinforced that like, no one's going to take me down. Fuck that. Not even cancer. And so it was like self-affirming. When I look back on that, I'm like, first of all, how pathetic. You don't even give yourself a break. Two, all you're doing is telegraphing insecurity. But more importantly, as a leader, I was telling my team, unless you get your ball cut off, you better show up, right? And so what does that do? It causes people to suppress what they're going through, and you get the worst out of them because eventually they break. So when I went through that, and it brought me to my knees, like as anyone out here understands who's been through divorce, that really made me reassess how I had been living as a person, as a manager. And I began to see that story as a sign of total weakness rather than strength. And I began reconstructing my sense of self-worth, not at what I had accomplished, but who I am. Because I do think when you lose a big part of your identity, your family changes, everything, you got it. You're left with like the remnants of the former version of yourself. And you have to say, okay, who am I without these things? And that's what really caused me to go through the therapy and really rebuild my sense of self-esteem.
People don't know this, but how you and I came to fruition here in a relationship is I had taken advantage of a offer you made to buy 50 of your books, and you would get 15 minutes with Pitch a Shark with Matt Higgins. And Matt and I ended up finding out we share a lot in common, and I'm going to go into some of those things, but and then he was nice enough to agree to come do the podcast and give back to the law enforcement community, which I can't thank you enough. But, I have to imagine that you come from this dysfunctional childhood. Father leaves, mother is disabled. You're caring for the whole family. You're the person in the middle. Everybody else seems like they're chaos. And you're the only person who's essentially the rock and dependent upon, at least in some sense, for everybody in your family. And then I would imagine the next progression is you meet somebody, you find yourself building something that you never thought you would have. And then when you got it, it was so precious, right? You had this thing that you had never had your whole life in this family. You started a family, and then all of a sudden that collapses. That's the palace. That's supposed to be the holy place of where it's untouchable. So when that collapses on the inside, I don't think people can understand the amount of trauma that comes with this, because finally you have some stability in your life, I'd imagine, the things you've always wanted, and all of a sudden it starts to crumble. How could this happen to me? So walk me through that a little bit and how you came out of that.
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it. And again, anyone out there going through it, especially, this is nuanced, but especially when you are running from trauma and you begin to create these moments where everything will be okay. After that, everything will be okay. And by the way, then I'll rewind and I'll deal with all the shit that I haven't dealt with, right? Like and everyone, I bet you listening here who's suppressing some version of trauma and doesn't feel, they can acknowledge it to someone. I know in your mind, you're aware of it and you're saying, I'll deal with it, at this point. And so that's what happens. And, you finally get to this place of supposed safety. Plus, and you could relate to this, you really want to give your children what you didn't really have, the stability that you didn't have. And then all of a sudden you're not in a position to do that. I don't have any great answers other than you do really find out what you're made of when you go through that, right? You find out what are you willing to endure? What are your priorities? On a positive note, I do think it enabled me to kind of connect in a way I never before as to what am I made of? Well, what happens when you strip everything away? Who am I? And, my way of getting through it was realizing, like, once you have children, everything is just about the kids. Doesn't mean you don't get to exist, but when you've made a choice and like that is the thing you're going to really regret getting wrong, on your deathbed. And so it is very clarifying. And I just tried to put my focus the best way I could on the little ones. And then also made sure that never again would I feel like my sense of self-worth is going to be dependent upon something I've achieved or something I have. Like, it has to be intrinsic, and not to get all Buddhist on everybody, but like, you really do have to believe that you're born whole and that you were put on this earth complete. Nothing completes you, and you'll leave this earth complete too. So I went heavy into this book called Buddhism Plain and Simple, if anybody's looking for a book out there. And it's something I return to like at least once a month to read again. Whenever I read Buddhism texts of all, and I don't say I'm a Buddhist because you don't actually say you are, you just are if you want to be. But I read that text. I read that text a lot, and also did a decent amount of therapy.
Obviously, going through a separation is a difficult thing, and I think that in life, when we get presented with basically a hand of cards that you never thought you were going to be handed, people have a hard time understanding that there's two ways to play a hand of cards. I think people sometimes see there's just one way. So how did you see this as this is how it's going to be? I either can do it this way or do it this way. And on top of that, if you chose the way that I think you probably chose, which was to try to make the best of what you have, make do with what God has given you, how has your relationship with your ex-wife or the co-parent of your children progressed or degenerated based on some of that conversation? And by the way, if there are conversations that can't be talked about publicly, I don't
Yeah,
want
I
to go
try
that
not to
route.
yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I try not to get too much into that, but can I talk about mindset a bit? And I talk about this in my book, the book Burn the Boats that we were talking about a second ago, that when I was very young and my mother she was very depressed and felt very persecuted by life, kind of defeated, and looked to me as the hero child, we would have these conversations about just how unfair things were and how depressing they were. And thank God I was born with a degree of defiance, but I would
Mhm.
always, it never rang true to me that I was put on this earth and I don't get a vote. You know what I mean? Like, I'm going to be perpetually victimized and oppressed. And I remember this is a true story. I had a seminal conversation with her. We were debating this. I probably was like 15 or something. And I was telling her and I was reinforcing my crazy plan that I'm going to get left back for 2 years straight so that I burned the boats and I got no choice but to drop out. I'm going to execute this hack that I have discovered that if I do well enough on the GED, I can go to college and I can get the hell out of this roach infested shoebox. That was my plan. And we're going to get out of poverty. And I remember we were having one of these conversations and I was like, Mom, I refuse to accept this idea that I'm not in control of my life. And so from here on, rather than things happening to me, I happen to things. And I remember thinking, well, that's easy for a kid to say. Like, you don't know what it's like to be dying. And I was like, I will soon enough, and everyone will. I said, but that's how I'm going to see the world. No bullshit. Like from that moment forward, it was like a psychic break. I kind of became a little disassociated with my settings, but I also said, no matter what, I'm going to figure out every action has an equal and opposite reaction. It's Newton's third law of motion, but it applies to everything, right? So if I was born in this hellhole, as a result of being that, I was able to see my mother with a GED that she got inadvertently because she grew up in poverty too. She didn't mean to become a GED, but that opened my eyes to a hack. Wait a second, I don't have to accept working at a deli, trying to take my classes after having spent, overnight at a deli, taking the Q88 in Queens, my butterfly knife, hoping not to get jumped on Queens Boulevard. For those who know Queens, like I don't have to accept that because there's a hack. And the only reason I saw the hack is because my mother has a GED. And by virtue of that hack, I pulled forward my entire career by 2 years, and I end up as press secretary at 26. So I pulled from that, and that's the whole purpose of my book, that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, and every crisis has the same thing too. So even when I went through my worst moments, whether it's cancer and also divorce, I was like, there is an equal and opposite reaction even of that. And here's what it is. When you're a dad, right, it is easy for you to define your role as only the provider and the moneymaker, right? And you're gonna see the kids when they can play ball or whatever it is that you really fantasize about as a dad, right? That's not how it works, right? Like that's why they made a whole song about it, Cats in the Cradle. Like if you wait too long, they'll be gone, and they're not like little pawns. They're not property. And so I do think because of the focus that brings to you when you have to be a dad in that kind of situation, it makes you infinitely better than you probably would have been under other circumstances. So I guess it's a long way of saying that every bad thing that happens, I always think of the equal and opposite reaction. And I swear to you, anyone listening, this is 1000% true. The problem is you have to believe it to be true in order to find it. It doesn't just like land on your lap. Like I wouldn't have the idea. No one, my guidance counselor would be like, hey, Matt, I know you're living in a roach motel and mom is slowly dying in the room next door. I have an idea. If you drop out of high school at 16, you could get a job a lot earlier and you'll end up as press secretary of Mayor of New York. I had to believe it and look for it. Thank God I was given that, innate capacity. So anybody going out there, anything bad, this has never failed me, this logic. It is always true. Same thing with the pandemic. But for the pandemic, I don't write this book. But for me writing this book, I don't get direct messages from people all over the world who said, I never had anybody who believed in me until you believed in me. And you wrote that book and you held up a mirror to confirm what I already suspected, right? No pandemic, no book. So that's my mindset.
I'm going to jump into the book for a second and boomerang back because I have another question. But, I thought about the book this morning and I thought to myself, what a gift to go into a room per se and make art and then hand it to the world for essentially $20.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, but it's the truth.
That's how I feel. I mean, I feel that way.
It's a gift for $20. For $20, you get to listen to Matt's story and then it might inspire you. And I can't emphasize to people, I read a lot of books. Burn the Boats is one of the best books I've ever read. And, that's what I was thinking about this morning. Like, man, this guy literally, because I think to myself, if I'm going to write a book, what's the book going to be? Well, I'm not ready for it yet, but then that's kind of an excuse and da-da-da and all this
Right,
bullshit.
exactly. You're doing
Right. Yeah. So, I just want to make sure, like, I was asked if I wanted to do a TED talk from somebody recently, and I was like, I want to make sure I get it right, but I don't want to over procrastinate. But I think about the things that even today, coming on this podcast, spending some time with me and our audience, they're constant gifts that you're giving out. So I just want to acknowledge you for that, because I think it's really fucking cool, dude. And that's what we try to do here as well.
Thank you. I mean, selfishly, it feels like it brings meaning to everything, right? I mean, I feel sometimes a little bit frozen in time. I witnessed what it's like to be powerless. That was my mother's journey. Created a lot of, not bitterness, but just sort of frustration that the cavalry wasn't coming. And I watched a human being disintegrate and literally die in her chair by the time she was 26. The last thing my mother ever said to me on the way out to become press secretary of the mayor of New York, I was sleeping on a dog-worn mattress on the floor because I had left that environment and the environment had crumbled to the ground, right? It was like such a horror show that I had no answers for. We had no money and I had to bathe her. I resented everything. I was 26, never had a friend over, never had a girl over. I was like, I hate this life, but I'm going to transcend it. And I leave to go to work that day and she calls me. It's in the book. And she's like, Matt, I'm like, what? I have to. She wanted me not to go to work that day. And she's like, I don't feel good. I was like, you never fucking feel good. And we have no money. And I'm press secretary of the mayor. Fucking Giuliani's not exactly a forgiving guy. Like, sorry, Mayor, I can't go to work today on my first day. So I got to go. But she's like, could you just give me a little applesauce? And I'm like, why applesauce? She was very obese by that point. She's like, I'm going to get better. I'm gonna lose weight. I'm only going to eat applesauce from now on. And she's like, I want to fit on a plane. And I tell that story because, like, man, right? Like, last thing I ever heard her was this unrealized dream. And she wanted to plead with God to get one more day. And then, of course, I didn't know. So my point is, if somebody had just intervened, like basically said, we'll help, she wouldn't have died. She's only 55 at the time. And so I never forgot that. There's two ways to respond to that. Frustration that people didn't help, and I was pissed off. I really was. Actually, the mayor was so nice. Like, he asked me, is there anything you could do? And I was like, well, my mother only felt any dignity when she went to Queens College. Do you think we could take the casket through the college? And he's like, I'll give her, full motorcade. So he did. So that was at the end of the funeral. My brother comes to the funeral, flowers everywhere, full of all these people. He's like, Matt, was mom a made woman? Like, who the fuck are these people? Like, so the point of telling you all that, I had two ways to respond to that, because we do always get a chance to respond. I can be bitter and deny people the empathy that was denied me, deny people the helping hand that was denied me. Or I could take away the enormity of what would have happened had somebody done what I now plan to do. And that's what I chose to take away from it. And so I've been accumulating a lot of authority over these years, and power and money, whatever. But the best use of that authority is to ameliorate suffering. It's why, and we can get into it, why I've had 2 meetings with Pope Francis in the last year and a half, which is a crazy statement, but working on migrants and refugees. But the book, if I could use my God-given communication skills that I once used on behalf of the mayor or whatever, if I could use them to write this story in a way that has a degree of inception, you know what I mean? It is interesting, compelling, a little bit cringy, not cringy rather, because it's so painful at times, and inspire somebody to change their life. I'm doing what I wish somebody had done for me in that little apartment, and I'm doing it at scale.
So it's interesting, the motivation of the book. I think a lot of authors write a book and they want to get press behind it and get this thing off the ground. And, I think a lot of times it's for selfish reasons.
That's true.
I got to be honest with you. I now really understand what the motivation is to push this book. It's deep rooted as to why you have such motivation. It's in there. It's good because the power this thing has. And
that's why you honestly, like, I'm always auditing, right? Like, because I'm intellectually curious about things I get wrong, right? I'm not one of those people. It's like, my bird isn't like burn the boats with you in it, fuck everyone. It's like I'm inquisitive even about where I get it wrong. So I need the feedback to sustain me, for you to be like, hey, it's a great book. It's doing what you hope to do. That's like, okay, good. I'll push it further. If it didn't work, I'd stop pushing it, right? Because I'd be like, well, then it's about ego, and this isn't about ego.
I think you knew it was going to work when you made it.
I did.
And I
I
think
did. But you don't want to be delusional either, right? Like, I don't know. I assumed it would. I put 2 years of effort into it, right? But just in case, I'm always checking in, like, did it work? Is it good? Okay, I'll push it.
how do you think people perceive the story?
I think people take what they need from it, which I love, because if you pick up the book, it's because you need the book. It is, I think there's a certain group of people, maybe somebody out there listening, they hear the phrase burn the boats and they think it's bombastic and it's a degree of like to hell with everyone else. And then they read it and it's the opposite. I wrote this book for the risk adverse or for the anxiety laden, because those are the ones that need the most help going all in, right? The whole premise of the book is that, and we can go into a little bit of the origin if that's okay.
Yeah.
I'm sure a lot of people, especially because law enforcement, some military on the listening to this, understand the origin of the phrase. We've heard burn the boats. It's attributed to Cortez in 1519, who conquered Mexico by literally burning 10 of his 11 boats to signal to his men he has no escape. But what I found fascinating is actually burn the boats is the OG life hack that goes back to the beginning of recorded history. It's just no one had connected the dots before. Before Cortez, there was Tariq, who conquered Spain in 711. And before him, there was a Chinese general in 2006 BC who did the same thing, killed his commander because he was complacent and burned the boats. I mean, like all the way back, Sun Tzu, Art of War, 500 BC, the ancient Israelites, Alexander the Great. This tactic goes back to the beginning of recorded history. So what made me curious is like, why is it that military leaders, when their back is against the wall, understand that the way to get the most out of ourselves is to eliminate choice, whereas we're conditioned to believe that having a fallback plan is what you really need. And so I said, okay, well, there's this doctrine. I feel like I've been following this my whole life, putting myself in situations where I sabotage my retreat. Like I mentioned earlier, failing every class in high school so that I was irredeemable and I had to drop out. So it doesn't apply in peacetime. And when I did the research on the literature, and I talk about this in a book, there's a great study out of 2014 out of Wharton that looked at what is the impact of somebody who has a plan A just being allowed to think about a fallback plan, not actually do anything about it. Can we measure it? And can we measure the impact? What they found is two things. One, it dramatically reduces the likelihood you're ever going to achieve plan A. And two, it actually makes you care a lot less. So why is that when we're told actually that's prudent? And the reason is energy leakage. Anyone listening here who has a really compelling big dream, that is their plan A, their true purpose, it requires a reach to reach beyond your limitations, to reach outside of your circumstances, your comfort zone. You need 110% of your energy. So when you have a plan B, just that little 10% energy leakage is enough to make you never achieve your true dream. So everything your mom and dad told you is wrong. But the problem is people get hung up with their anxiety or their risk aversion or their practical issues. They don't have a way to fully commit. And what I offer in the book is a blueprint for how to process fear and risk and anxiety at the beginning of the journey so that you can already know you contemplated the worst case scenario, how to bounce back from shame. The cover of the boat is actually, it looks like it's a fiery pagan symbol for those who are watching, but actually it's a paper boat floating in a child's bathtub, because so much of the issues that we need to deal with, to burn, come back from childhood. For me, it was the issues related to the shame of the way I was brought up and not being able to save my mother, the fact that I was running from the boogeyman, whatever they are. So big picture, my book is written for those out there who have always struggled with fully commit because they're afraid. Now, what I like is when somebody picks this book up and assumes it's like this jingoistic screed, screw everybody. I've gotten a couple of reviews and people are like, what is this woke bullshit? I'm like, woke? Because like, what? Because I'm empathetic? Like, somebody wrote that the other day. It was like, and it was great because they said woke bullshit or woke gibberish, and I could totally tell the writer's political leanings. I'm like, let me see, press secretary of the mayor of New York, worked for Mitt Romney and John McCain. Okay, but anyway, like it's funny. There is a certain segment of the population, if God forbid you express a little bit of empathy. I made one point in the book, which I will stand by, that if you were a little black kid growing up in my neighborhood in Queens and you got a GED, it would be confirmatory, right? You would be judged. And certainly no one would be looking for the silver lining. Me, I get a GED and it's like, oh, what happened, young man? You know what I mean? And that's the difference of being a white kid growing up when I grew up. So I make that acknowledgement in the book. But anyway, so when you asked me what's the reaction been, those are kind of my favorite reactions. I'm like, is your heart so dark that you can't acknowledge that it is easier for some people to pull things off than others? And anyway, but back to the big picture. I appreciate you saying it resonates. It is not about ego. We all have egos. The ego is in the expression of the art, right? This is my art, and your point of making a gift, it does feel that way. But when people say they wrote a book so they could get the credential, I'm like, really? All that work so that you could put it on your resume? It feels kind of pathetic to me.
Hey guys, if you're enjoying the Street Cop podcast, do us a favor and give us a review on iTunes or Spotify, wherever you're listening to us. Tell a friend. We don't charge anything for the episodes. We appreciate your support. Check us out on any social platform by putting into the search bar Street Cop Trading. Give us a follow. We have a lot of free content coming out every single day that you might not catch here on the podcast, and it's important for you to be able to do your job more professionally, and we also entertain you as well. Is your heart dark? It's so funny you brought this up because this morning, typically what I like to do is wake up, I'll meditate, then I'll cook breakfast, make like a continental breakfast for my kids every single day. It's just my thing because typically I'm not home for dinner. We're not a Orthodox style family that you would think that my wife's coming out with an apron on and she's making tuna casserole. It's just not how the life of the Benino household works. But every morning after I make breakfast, I usually sit down, have a cup of coffee. It's like my pre-workout, just a black cup of coffee. I really just thoroughly enjoy it. And I put something on YouTube, something that kind of almost gets suggested by YouTube. And today it was about being resilient. I actually sent it to a friend of mine going through some real difficult stuff. And he said, I appreciate you send this over. I listened to the whole thing. It was 41 minutes. And I went, really, that fast? He goes, so you could tell that where he's at and what he needs to hear. And the whole thing was narrated by a black guy, right? An African-American dude. And I thought to myself, it's so weird how these thoughts get triggered. I'm like, I don't really think anybody is genuinely, and I this is a very strange statement, and it just comes off to this, is your heart dark? I really don't believe people are genuinely in their bones have that much hatred towards other people based on ethnicities and races and religions. I think that they're just unintelligent and undereducated. And I think a lot of people can be diverted back with some common sense discussion. So often in class, I'll say things that are things you wouldn't typically hear from a police trainer because I feel like I'm a little more enlightened. And once I explain it to people and helping them understand, like, so for example, in the state of New Jersey, I don't know if you know this, being a New Jersey resident, police officers now, according to the Attorney General, because we have the legalization of marijuana, can smoke weed. As nuts as that fucking sounds. So when I say this, I like to bring this on the road with me, and I'll say to 150 guys in a class and girls, hey, in Jersey, if you guys want to smoke weed, come be a cop with us.
You know what's great about this tape? This isn't going to age well. I'm going to show it to you in 10 years. Be like, hey, boomer, remember when you said this on this tape? But keep going.
So, dude, they'll go, oh, it's fucking crazy. I can't believe they're going to smoke weed. I go, you know what I think's crazy? I think what's crazy is when half of this room goes to a country music concert, tailgates, drinks 14 beers, 7 shots tequila, and then drives home, crashes their car, and gets into domestic. I said, what's the worst thing that's going to happen? You smoke some weed. You're going to eat a lot of Cheetos. You're going to laugh too much. So let's just, and people are just like, oh shit, I never thought of it that way. Right. Because at the inception of it, you've been conditioned from your surroundings that weed's this evil thing. I'm not saying it is or isn't. My friend Josh Fidel was shot in the head in Atlantic City. I don't know if you remember, this was about 5 years ago, during a botched robbery, interrupted a street robbery. Guy runs past and puts a bullet in his head. So I had dinner with him about a month ago, and he's all atrophy. He's a great guy. He's amazing. And he looks over, he's like, yo, you want some shrooms? And I'm like, dude, I've never done shrooms in my life. He's like, no, they're not like crazy shrooms. He's like, they're just like these dosed down gummy things that and I'm like, I think in my head, like, we just demonize this. And he's like, bro, they really help me a lot. And we just demonize these things because we're so conditioned to demonize this stuff. So, I think that you expressing empathy and compassion comes from a place of high level of intelligence. And sometimes you say those things and people don't like that shit, but that's what makes you brave, right? That's the courage behind being a leader.
Yeah. And funny on the marijuana thing, I went through that same evolution too. Like, wow, we're decriminalizing everything, and now it's like a lazy society. And then you take a step back and say, a third of all violent incidents at the ER are alcohol related, right? Like, and you try to, again, I tried to find a study to disprove this the other day, and of course there are a couple that tries to disprove what I'm about to say. But let's just use our common sense. How many folks do you know that made really horrendous decisions having taken a gummy? You know what I mean? Like, or violent. Like, it just doesn't map to your common sense. Like, forget about driving. That's bad, obviously, under the influence, but it just doesn't map. And yet we were conditioned all these years to think that somehow that is terrible, but alcohol is okay. And look at the poison that alcohol is: DWI and violence, domestic crime. So I agree with you. Back to people are not fundamentally have dark hearts. I think that is largely true, although I think there's a decent percentage of the population that are true sociopaths, and then their cousin, the narcissist. And I know this sounds a little nutty, but again, I was obsessed with justice as a kid, and I used to put up, I used to go to the library and go to microfiche and pull up like the different world tragedies. I don't know why, and just to be reminded of the horrible things people do. I've been obsessed with the Holocaust. Every time I go to Germany and I meet with anybody German, I'm like, always make sure I stop by Dachau or something. Like, oh, I was just visiting the terrible things you people did, lest we forget. But like, that's still coursing through DNA, right? People were capable of being so inhuman. So I am always on the lookout for a degree of sociopathy that just does. I mean, everybody listening to this knows this better than I am, right? You must have looked into the eyes of monsters before, and that isn't just ignorance or environment. That's just pure evil. Maybe not. Maybe you don't feel that way, but I feel that.
No. Listen, I worked in jail to start for 2 years, and there's no better place to see people that have no hope. And I worked in, of course, at 19 years of age in a housing unit that housed murderers. And these were, talk about indoctrination into law enforcement and getting thrown to the wolves immediately. So it was a sink or swim experiment, what I was told later on, because I was a 19-year-old kid from, essentially lower middle class suburbs going into the pits of hell, essentially. And, some of these people I would look at and say, there's nothing this is one cold motherfucker who's just conforming to living their life as is in this, and there'll be nothing more for these people. And sometimes there was misguided, but I got to tell you, some of these murderers, a majority of them, they were cold, man. They were, again, we all had to get along because they still had to live as human beings. But I look at some of these guys' eyes as a young kid, and I'm like, God, this is a bad dude. So yeah, I believe that there was some of that there for sure. And then also on the other side of things, I would probably not at that time look at some of these people saying, here's a person who screwed up and deserves a second shot. And I think when we go back into looking how they ended up here, I had a guy one time tells me, he goes, I said something, I passed the comment about how these people were living. And this is a big dude, big guy. His name is Ronald. Every corrections officer liked him. He had been there his whole life. He commanded a lot of respect. He had a big personality, and he gave respect to the COs, and he just was one of those guys who was a name in the jail, but had a good sense of humor, was a tough dude. And he said to me one time, he goes, Benino, I heard you pass a comment about that guy's room there before about how filthy it is. I go, it's disgusting. He said, bro, did you ever have to go down to the corner store and steal chips because you were starving because there was no food for you? And I'm like, nah. He's like, because that guy that you're talking about, I grew up in the same neighborhood and that's how we lived. He goes, did you ever have to worry about who was coming to your house because your mother was a prostitute and she was smoking crack? And I'm like, nah. And he's like, yeah, well, that was my life. That's how I grew up. I grew up in a crack house. My mother was a prostitute. And here he is. And, so it makes you think, you go back on these things and you're like, damn, right? Like, we're so quick to judge on some of these people. And I don't think he was an inherently bad person where he would ever murder somebody or rape somebody. I think he was just a street guy who was constantly hustling because that's all he knew. And to watch adults not know how to read, I'm watching inmates read to other inmates their letters they get from their families. So I think all throughout life, we get these lessons of, 41 years old, going on 42 now. I'm like, reflecting constantly on all this shit that I've been through. I have a question for you. Since you're always training, you're obviously built this amazing business, training cops, doing an incredible service. You have endless stories of the way your training has changed someone's life. How do cops retain empathy when subjected to
aggression in both directions.
I think when they hear it from a trusted source, because if you don't have a trusted source, you're going to be just a product of what you're surrounded by. In police departments, albeit made up of wonderful human beings that are very, very toxic because they're human beings and they're getting beat up nonstop. 200, where I worked, we had 130,000 residents, 250,000 people during the day. How are you seeing the same 12 to 23 people every single week? Right. So we're not seeing the other 129,750 people that are great in this town. And I'll just give you one. I don't want to rant on. When I was a new cop, I came to now it's my third job. I'm at the town that I grew up in, and I went back to my high school. And so my high school had changed dramatically in 5 years. It had gotten very out of control. And my friend Joe was with me. And the first day I worked with him, I said, how do you guys work here with these fucking kids just doing whatever they want? There is no rules here. They just rope. It's wild, dude. Even 5-7 years later, I've been here. And he said to me, I'll never forget this. He goes, there's a lot of good kids here, I never saw the good kids. And I looked around. I went, this motherfucker, I've been seeing the same 15 assholes every time I come to this school. And I didn't realize there was 300 great kids here. So I try to tell these stories and hopefully give men and women in law enforcement perspective, even using this podcast, of there is a way to see the world, right? Sometimes you can't see it that way because it's a safety issue. But the reality is a lot of this job and the success of being a cop has to do with compassion and empathy. And a lot of times people don't tell you that, so
but look what you just did right now. I love when I have a thought that I've never occurred to me my entire life. Like the idea that a cop is seeing the same 50 people, of course, right? Makes sense on your beat, your neighborhood, right? Of course, crime is committed by a very small minority of people, and those are the people you're dealing with. And without that context and zooming out, how that could affect your brain, it's fascinating. So you just answered it.
I have a question for you because this is one for me. And it's so funny. The more we talk, I'm just like, God, we're the fucking same. We go on for days. I mean, such similarity in so many ways. And I did want to get into special needs and things like that. But, later on in life, I think typically a lot of us believe that we're not fitting into the mold of the school systems and getting A's and B's. And you're kind of led to believe that you're unintelligent. When was the moment that you realized that you were actually very intelligent? And because I know that you had to start thinking that something's got to be wrong with me. I'm not doing well in school. I've got all this stuff going on and behind me. But when did you realize that shit, I'm going to be able to do some shit here, right? When did that happen?
If I'm being honest, I think my journey is a little different. It would be easier to just simply let people infer that, I'm a redemption story. I'm an intentional story. I knew very young that I had, I hate using the word gifts, but certain abilities, and I didn't care if anything confirmed it. And so when I dropped out of school, it was completely a belief in myself that I could bypass high school. And I was like, this seems like a grand old waste of time. I don't think I'm going to need trigonometry or calculus or even algebra. You know what I mean? I was like, I just don't think those are useful. I think the time matters more, and I'll figure it out later. And so I knew, when I was 10, 11, 12, that I had the ability to skip all this, to be honest. So mine is not the redemption story of a troubled kid made good. Mine is a story of a kid putting him in trouble so he could make good. And to explain that a little bit more about why that ties into burn the boats. When I came up with this plan, I was excited. And I remember consulting, talking to the adults. I'd get picked up by the truant cops. I don't know if they still do that anymore, but, they'd raid McDonald's, you'd run, or Alley Pond Park machines, drinking wine coolers behind the bleachers. And I'd get picked up and I'd be like, you don't understand. I got a plan. You know what I mean? Here's the plan. Look at this. I checked it out. I went to the, college night, and I asked them, excuse me, sir, if somebody would do good enough on the GED, can I go to college? Can I go to your student? Of course, they're all condescending. No one ever does. It's like, yes, young man, we believe in second chances. And so, but everybody kept trying to intervene and guilt the shit out of me. My guidance counselor, Mr. Barkman, was like, you're never going to shake the stigma of being a loser. It's not practical. Plus, when you get to college, you're not going to be able to perform as a 16-year-old. And I'm like, why? Do they have calculus in college? I looked that up too. It seems like I could take the law of bullshit. You know what I mean? I could take easy classes. And plus, I could make my own schedule. And I could work 2 jobs. Makes perfect sense. And the whole weight of conventional wisdom was against me. on the one hand. And on the other, I had the reality of this dirty apartment, my mother kind of slipping away, my common sense telling me, we're like taking buses to food pantries so we can hide the fact that we're living on someone else's charity. I was like, it doesn't add up. But then I'm like, well, you don't have that information, Mr. Guidance Counselor or Mr. Police Officer. I'm going to have to make this bold decision. And that's when I realized, if I don't actually fail everything, I'm going to equivocate, because I was always like, oh, is this crazy? Like, whatever. So, but if I fail everything, I'll hit a tipping point, a point of no return, and you'll leave me alone. And I remember I would sit in the back of this room, my head on the desk. Mrs. Vega was my teacher. Kids with beepers, the drug dealer kids and the gang kids. And I'd be like, this feels right. I called it the land of misfit toys. And you imagine, it was like, what is he doing? But here's what happened. And you and I talked about this the other day. Eventually, I did cross that point of no return, where the system cared more about getting me off the books as a statistic. And there was a program back then, I don't know if it still exists, the School for Auxiliary Services, some bullshit euphemism. It basically means if you transfer me across the street, I'm not a dropout, I transferred. And so that's where everyone came about. Hey, Matt, when are you going to transfer? I'm like, well, I'm getting a little cozy here, being, like I'm not ready. I'm not sure. I don't know if I can pull this off. And anyway, the moment came and I did it. So the long answer is I always knew I was born with that defiance, had a good sense of self. But the burn the boats move was sabotage. And once I sabotaged, I was like, oh, that's what gave me the courage to do it, is that I had no choice. I manufactured it. And then it became a little bit of a drug. So fast forward, we didn't get to this, but the first time I decided I would be a teacher, and I was like, I could teach at my college. That would probably be pretty easy. I was like, but that wouldn't be a total challenge. I was like, what would it take to teach at Harvard Business School? What would it take for a kid with a GED to go become a teacher at Harvard Business School? And I became obsessed with that goal, even though I never taught before. And I worked for a year of my life to convince the school and to work on a curriculum to teach at Harvard Business School. And the first day I remember walking into that room like, damn, like this is intimidating, right? But again, I put myself in a situation, a point of no return, and then I give myself, maximum performance.
How do you translate what you know about the school systems and life and success, and probably a lot more than most people are privy to your children?
Such a good question. If I'm honest, I don't feel like I have to. They are the biggest thing you could do for a children when you have wealth or you come from a situation very different than you were born into. The worst thing I think you could do is to try to manufacture it. Because if you're honest with yourself, wouldn't I have been happier being in a 2-parent household that didn't have dysfunction? Wouldn't I have been happier to not go through years of therapy? So to try to, manufacture it is inauthentic, because I would have chosen that life any day of the week. And also, why did I work so hard but to create that environment for my kids? I think where you do disservice to your children is when you begin to identify your self-worth by the things you have and the things you've done. And so I feel like I've done a pretty good job of not defining who I am by either of those things. I'm not very vested in my accomplishments. They're only a tool to give me authority to write that book, to get people to care, to listen to this podcast. And the wealth and the money is so irrelevant and pathetic to think that somehow should enhance my self-esteem. So I think because I have that attitude, my children show no signs of, constructing their self-worth around that. So, but other than that, I don't try to manufacture hardship.
Try to redirect their energy, because obviously they go to a school and things are said and kids are kids and they see things and who has this house, who has that house. And I try to, anytime I hear that, I try to recorrect that behavior. Like, oh, so-and-so's house is not as big as ours. And I'm like, that has nothing to do with anything, just so we're clear, boys and girls. And, really try to.
This generation does more wealth shaming than we ever did back in the day. I find that crazy.
I don't think we had context. I think we were all poor.
Yeah, that's actually,
I didn't know anybody.
Actually, that's a really funny point. I think that's right, because when I was growing up, all you wanted to do was hide your poverty by wearing designer jeans. And this generation wants to hide their affluence. And I find, but maybe it's because they're all moderately wealthy, and it's gross, and they know enough to know that it's gross. So, I don't know.
I think the internet plays a big part in children, and you've got to be as a parent cognizant of that as well. So, half the time, whether you like it or not, your kids are getting raised on the internet. If it's not even through your children directly, it's indirectly through their friends. It's where they're finding stuff. So Well, they latch on to shit, they believe it, and they'll pass it along. So I don't think we had exposure to that. I remember going to a house with my father was an electrician. I got basically punished and had to go every Saturday and go to work when my friends played. And I don't think that has any relevance to my success now. And I'd like to say that it does, but I don't think it does. I was just pissed the whole fucking time. Oh, it was the worst. But I remember going to this house in Freehold, which is one town over from where I live, and my father doing multiple jobs there and putting in like gazebos and running lines for the heaters for the pools and the ditch witch. I remember all this stuff, but I remember going to this house and saying to myself, man, I hope one day that I can have something like this. And it just gave me context. But I got to be honest with you, Matt, I'd come back home and be very frustrated with my circumstances. Not that we were that broke. We certainly didn't have a lot. But in some sense to other people, we did have a lot. So it's hard to gauge that. And, I think anywhere you're at in life, you could say, oh, I don't have enough or we have too much. It's really how you see it and where it comes from. There's a lot of things, but.
Well, I again, there's no bullshit. Like, no. I actually sometimes feel bad as to what I'm aware. Imagine you grow up in this generation and everyone needs like a redemption narrative where like they struggled and then they overcome it and now they're better for it. If you don't have that, you have like nothing because everybody guilts you for not having it, right? So in some respects, everything's flipped 180, which I also think is a shame. Like people will say to me, hey, when you're interviewing, do you look for like that, that Matt Higgins, like who, went to a terrible school and like, you only take kids who show struggle. And some CEO was telling me that's what he does. And to hell with the Harvard kids. I'm like, well, that's not fair. Just because somebody was born in, idyllic, circumstances based on your view, how do you know their dad wasn't cruel and alcoholic and never hugged them or, you know what I mean? And like, it's just so simplistic. It's again, a lie because it presupposes that I wouldn't have chose that life if given an option. And two, if you get there, your kids will be those kids, right? So I try to go out of my way to actually give credit where credit's due. Like it's very hard to go to Harvard, very hard to go to those great places. I don't judge people who didn't, but I certainly credit people who did, right? And so I find that there's so much inauthenticity lately. Everyone's pressured to have this redemption story and then have it all figured out. And like, I think it's okay to have a perfectly fine life too.
I think that guys like you and I do a lot to ensure that we do not judge people on any way. The question is are we as good as not judging ourselves?
No, I'm terrible. I mean, part of what I always say, I wrote my book to read my book. And so anyone who reads my book, I need to give this disclaimer. I asterisk the shit out of that book. Like, however, I only follow this 17% of the time. Like, so the book is aspirational. And if anyone is telling the truth, their book is aspirational too. The guy who wrote Atomic Habits, like, please, he'd be like an automaton, you know what I mean? Like a robot. Like, so but I think you're right. I am so hard on myself. At this point, I've given up trying not to be, frankly. I just try to channel it in the pursuit of excellence. Like there is no other way. I don't know how to distinguish between pursuit of excellence and cutting myself slack. Those do seem to be in tension, to be honest. Like my weight goes up and down. I've been a binge eater. It's like a constant struggle, you know what I mean? Bearing my emotions and like these crazy food episodes that would make you cringe, burying the chips on the bottom of the garbage so that the wife doesn't see it, like these behaviors. And I try again. And again, part of the reason why I was so honest in the book was for authenticity. At least let me make a gift of that vacillation. And when I look at Instagram and you sort of analyze the narrative of the people who are self-professed gurus or, lifestyle coaches who never ran a business in their life and telling you how to live and all this, bullshit, that is the common thread, is that there's been a stumble, redemption, and everything's okay and figured out. Now I'm going to teach you. My journey is progress and regress, and I'm commiserating with you. I'm not lecturing you. My book is meant to commiserate and maybe hold up a mirror to what you're capable of, but it's not to purport that I can implement all the advice that I'm sharing with you, because that's part of my journey. I opened up the book. My book was supposed to start with a hero story about how during the pandemic, I raised $200 million in a SPAC from this chair and my boxer shorts. I did an IPO, which is kind of crazy, right? I was like, wait a second, what's the arbitrage? I don't have to leave the house, and I raised $200 million, rang the bell at the stock exchange. And the next day I got COVID and I got double pneumonia, came within an inch of my life, right? Like managed to stay out of the hospital, thank God, whatever. But yay, I recovered. Everything's going to be great. It was the beginning of the book. What happens? The market crashes. Everything tanks. I give back the $200 million. The SPAC fails. Fuck. Okay, but there's another story in the beginning of the book. What's better than being on Shark Tank? Well, having your own Shark Tank, right? Like, I'm going to create my own TV show. It was called Business Hunters, going to be on CNBC. I shot it in Florida, had to go back, juggle the kids, 17 trips in 40 days. Like, but it's an amazing show. It's the beginning of the book. Yay, hero narrative. The show gets canceled after the book has at the printer. And now I'm like, and the editor's like, well, what are we going to do with the beginning of the book? And then I was like, I think the universe is trying to tell me the book's supposed to start with true illustrations of failure so that we set the tone at the beginning of the book. That Burn the Boats is not about getting everything you want. Burn the Boats is about the relentless commitment to that which you care about. And then when it doesn't work out, extracting value from it, right? So I put those two in the beginning of the book anyway, because I guarantee you, if you interview me in 2 years, I will be able to draw a line between those two failures, supposedly failures, and how I extracted more value from them than would have happened if I didn't fail. And it's not because I'm lucky. It's because I am committed and determined, back to the Newton's third law of motion, to identify the equal and opposite reaction. I went and raised a public company. I now understand the public markets. I've been on CNBC 5 times in the last 4 weeks talking about the bank crisis, right? I went ahead and my show got canceled. And I was like, I'm never going to let anyone else cancel my show again. What's the only way I can make sure that never happens? I'm going to create a production studio. So 4 weeks ago, I launched my own production studio with my partner, Gary Vaynerchuk. That's my attitude. That's what I try to show in the book. People will say, Matt, it's not scalable. I was like, bullshit, of course it's scalable. You don't have to live at my level. I mean, I'm completely maladjusted. You should be totally, balanced. But you can draw from the lessons and the inspiration.
First off, we all eat like that, just so you're clear. Don't.
Okay, good. Right. Okay, good.
Yeah. Dude, I've had moments where I'm like looking at like 7 Devil Dog wrappers and I'm like, you're a fucking piece of shit.
Right.
Why would you do that? Like, as soon as it's done, I'm like, you're such a piece of shit. Like, you just couldn't go to sleep. You had to get up and fucking eat this shit. And
the worst now is, I don't know about you, I put it in my Fitness Pal though, so I have to stare at it like that is.
Because listen, dude, they say like you're your own worst critic. I actually think you're your own best critic in some sense. Where like, who knows you better than you, and how much of a piece
I
of
talk
shit
about that
you can
in the
make.
book. I say this in, again, a lyrical way, but exactly that sentiment, that the safest bets you place in life are the ones you place in yourself, because you'll never be a greater expert on you than you. Right. Sure. And like when you're working for a boss and they whack you one morning, you know what I mean? You couldn't anticipate. You can anticipate your own behavior. Right. So always bet on yourself. So I agree. We are our own worst critic, but we're also our own best teacher when we sort of calibrate it correctly.
I think anticipating your own behavior, knowing you the best, sets you up for the discipline to employ some ways to divert your behavior. And man, I'm constantly just checking myself with a lot of things going on. I'm like, hold on a second. If I start seeing me acting like this shit again, I'm like, gotta calm the fuck down. Like we're having our conference in 3 weeks, and I just made this thing a couple of days ago, but I just told the whole staff in here, I said, I'm not drinking till Wednesday. I know it's Nashville. I'm not touching alcohol till Wednesday. Peer pressure is going to come. We have all these keynotes coming. These dudes are going to want to hang out. I'll go out, but I'm going to drink water. And there's a reason, because I drank recently, goofing off for an occasion. And I was like, I can't fucking do this for this conference. It's too important. And that's the discipline, because I know where my weakness is. Hey, we're going to go have fun. I'm like, fuck, I love fun. That's my favorite thing to do. I fucking love fun. Right? So,
I've been auditing myself on to that point is when I want to, I might do, like, creep into my vocabulary and my brain from I have decided, right? Like, I think it's when we allow choice to enter into things that we already decided is when we run amok, right? Like, you get up at 5 a.m., going to the gym. When you ask yourself, do I want to go to the gym? It's when it all breaks down. Well, not for you, because you work out all the time. But like,
listen, let me just say something. I do right now, Matt Higgins. Right now, I'm on a good streak. But I'm going to tell you, it doesn't take much to disrupt it. It usually starts around Thanksgiving and ends up with about 700 cannolis from Thanksgiving to Christmas and through Christmas. And then I say to myself, what did you do? Where did you fall off?
For looking like a little cyborg that you do sitting in that dark alley.
Don't be confused. If I take this shirt off, you're going to feel a lot better about yourself. Trust me. It's not what you think it is. And I even beat myself up every single day. But I think there's good behind that a little bit too, because it's self-deprecating, but also self-motivating in some sense. All right, 2 more quick questions, and then we'll wrap. You go and do all these really difficult things through life, and people look at somebody who's successful and says, oh, this guy has no worries, no cares in the world. Life must be so easy there. But I imagine at times you're saying, God, I mean, come on, God, like, give me a fucking break here. I get it. I got some things, but could you at least give me a break on some of this? Like, let's take, how much more are you going to throw at me? What else are you going to send my way? One, how has that molded you now to deal with difficult times? And the second one is, maybe you can allude to when people look at your level of success and how that correlates to you just being a regular dude. So there's two questions there.
I mean, I think it's both good and bad. For those who have anxiety out there, and maybe you keep it a secret, and it's sort of your inside voice. I think if you were to start on a given first day of the month, April 1, and you would make two columns. On the left column would be all the things that you worry that might happen this month, all the catastrophe. And then at the end of the other column, you wrote down the bad things that did happen. You would find the right column were things you never anticipated, and the left column never materialized, right? And so the reality is, what you come to learn over time managing anxiety and life is that the bad things that are happening are things you don't really anticipate. And so it's a way to silence that, voice in your head. And then number two, it's what I alluded to in the beginning of the book. Like, it's not bullshit and rhetoric. Like, I use those those are big deal examples. Like, I lost a ton of money and 2 years of my life on that IPO. And then I got COVID the day I rang the bell. And like, I didn't see my kids for a month, and I had double pneumonia, and I was overweight. Like, that's real life. And I'm telling you with 100% conviction that I will extract more value from that than if it had worked out. And that the universe probably killed it to protect me from what would have probably been an even worse decision. And the same with the show. So how do I navigate when I do have, like every human, when something really bad happens, I usually go, can I just get a clean shot on goal once? I always imagine hockey. Like, can you just let me, like, just once? And like, what about the people? Where's the lotto ticket? You know what I mean? And then you realize, like, it's not meant to be and doesn't exist. So it's on me, right? I always think I always will have the last word until my last breath. So that's generally, my orientation. In terms of being, whatever, wealth, or I guess your question, how do you stay normal, or are you normal?
No. I think it has to do with a little bit of judgment, where people see and wonder what's life like at that level. And I think what I'm trying to get to is that more normal and more like you than you think it is. Maybe you could talk on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess we have to define what it means to be at my level. I guess a degree of wealth where you never worry about what a restaurant meal costs, or you don't have to necessarily balance a budget. Although you'd be amazed at some shockingly bad decisions that I make, like everybody else, financially. But I think money makes you more of who you are. It does not change you; it amplifies you. So I have been thinking a lot about this idea of "fuck you money." Like, what does the word "fuck you" money mean? And I realized actually "fuck you" money is the ability to tell the voice in your head, "fuck you." You know what I mean? Like, all the things I'm worried about. And by the way, the people around you that are judging your behavior, fuck you too. And by the way, if I want to be tender and sensitive and spend a lot of my time communicating, write this book, leading a hand, and people are going to judge my motive and think it's about ego, well, fuck you too. So I think it just amplified, it gave me the freedom to amplify the autonomy to choose who I wish to be, how do I want to show up in the world. But other than that, it doesn't really change you. So, but if you're arrogant and you know what I mean, and you judge other people, money's going to give you the power to say "fuck you" to more people. You know what I mean? So it's like, What is the definition of those two words to you? I love that I can curse with you, on this, like, with
this is fun.
This is that podcast.
Well, dude, you're a New York, New Jersey, tri-state guy. I mean, this is how we people don't understand that. Like, this is how we talk here.
It is.
If you don't talk like this, you're not trusted.
Gary Vaynerchuk is my partner, right? So I bring him. I don't know anybody. Do you know Gary Vaynerchuk, right? So he's a big internet star, and he's the partner of my agency. I bring him to Harvard Business School, and I'm like, Gary, please, can you leave the New Jersey at home? Like, just leave it in that little bagel store in Springfield, New Jersey, because I'll get the letters from the students afterwards. So,
all right, this is my last question. It's a good one. I think you're gonna like it. It's What do you say to somebody right now who's going through something very difficult in life that feels like it's never going to end?
Well, first of all, I don't want to say I've been there because I don't know what you're going through, but I've been in very, very dark places. Some of them I talk about in the book. And the one thing that is always true is if you just make even an imperceptible step in the right direction, progress, digging yourself out of that hole, the universe begins to take care of the rest. And that probably means opening yourself up to somebody else. We tend to judge ourselves and step into others' shoes and presume they're not going to accept us for whatever it is we're going through, that we're going to be judged, that the person that you're talking to can't possibly relate. We always prejudge how people will respond to our pain, and we don't give them a shot to step up. And that's some of the biggest regrets in my life, is I wish I had raised my hand and said, like, I am really struggling. Like, I really need a break. I wish I had cut myself some slack. So what I would say to anybody out there struggling, not everyone might respond to your pain because they might be carrying their own pain, but somebody will in your close circle if you just raise your hand, and that there is no shame in this world. There is literally nothing to be ashamed about. We are all dying. And I have a little app on my phone called We Croak. 5 times a day, it reminds me that I'm going to die. I know that sounds nuts. It's to give me peace that nothing matters that much. So whatever it is that you're carrying, whether it's shame or whether it's some type of anticipation about something very bad that's going to happen, I do find that when you open yourself up, not only are you giving yourself the opportunity for someone to help you and comfort you, you're also giving that person the space to share their own vulnerability. You are modeling what vulnerability looks like. And I have found when I share things like having one ball and going through divorce and talking about anxiety in the book at my level, people are like, I talk about how Shark Tank, I was like freaked out and felt like an imposter. By modeling that, I not only have soothed myself, but I've created space for other people to make an offering of whatever they're going through, and it's magical. It brings people close. So anybody listening, just take one step in that direction of opening up with somebody that you feel is the most trusted and empathetic in that circle. And not only will they'll meet you there, most likely, but you're going to help them open up to you something that they have been suppressing.
Very freeing stuff. It just becomes that vulnerability that I don't have anything to hide, and I want you to use what I've gone through to help you is very freeing to walk around with a lot of weight lifted off your shoulders, knowing that there's really nothing anybody's going to not know about you and just show up with. It's really
and again, if you can't get there through safety, get through by asking yourself, how long do you really give a shit when you hear something about somebody else? Like, even if you judged it, like if you're honest with yourself, you don't really care. You know what I mean? It doesn't last more than like a minute, right? Because we're too busy worrying about our own lives. So at the end of the day, nobody really cares that much either. You know what I mean? No one's going to judge you for more than a nanosecond.
Let's do this. I thought about this morning. I'll just do it right now. How about every person who buys a copy of Burn the Boats and sends me a receipt, I'll send you guys some street cop shit that's worth more than the book. And because I think that people need to take the time you could buy the audio version. Matt authored it, dictated himself. Thank God. He didn't have a ghost reader. No. Yeah, no, it was really good. It's important because I appreciate that as somebody who only learns really through audiobooks, but also purchase the book. We'll do the first 100 people that buy the book. We'll get some real cool shit from us. And I promise you'll be happy that you did it. So check out Burn the Boats on Amazon.com. What else? Where else they can find you, Matt Higgins?
I'm on LinkedIn. I use LinkedIn a lot. I'm on Instagram, and we didn't really get a chance to talk about business. But what happens is when people read the book, they've been harboring a dream, and then this becomes the catalyst. It's going to happen to somebody out there. And when that happens, DM me because I want to give you a little push. And I've created a newsletter so I can unite the boat burners, because like when you get inspired and then you want to hold on to it, you don't want it to end, and then a little bit time drifts away and you forget what inspired you. I want to help sustain that feeling, and I created a newsletter on Substack as well, but Instagram or LinkedIn.
This was awesome.
Thank you for doing that. And what I'll do is I will send you, I'll sign book plates, and I'll send you those book plates so that you can send them to whoever sends you those receipts.
That's badass, dude. Hey, listen, look, this is real last thing. Your message to law enforcement.
Man, I always think about how schizophrenic it is to, when you're desperate and you need help, you pick up you call 911, and you're so damn relieved when somebody shows up to help you, and yet we judge and we scapegoat. And so it never makes any sense to me. I feel so thoroughly grateful that somebody is willing to not only put themselves in harm's way, but willing to almost be Solomon-like and receive the scorn that happens sometimes in society tolerate the ignorance about what the job entails, but then want to make sure the squeegee person doesn't come up to you when you come out the tunnel. Like the level of inconsistency in our society right now is breathtaking. And yet every time I see a cop and I say thank you, like it's like so measured. And so the job is obviously harder now than it's ever been. But there are people like me who are so grateful. Like you are one of you're like the last line of defense, preventing the complete breakdown of society. And so I feel thank you. Hang on, because reason will return. That we'll realize that standards matter, right? And we have to support our law enforcement. You can't judge people with a broad brush. So I already feel it happening. When you look at New York and we're regressing and it's like people are heartbroken, like, wait, the city was so livable and governable. The pendulum will swing backwards. So hang in there, remain patient. But net, I just want to say thank you.
That was the best. That was the best, dude.
It's true, so man. Good. It's true. And people are going to wake up again, and they are. So just stay patient.
Listen, I have nothing else. So
you're the best.
I don't know if you want to, whenever you want to continue your conversation, if you want help with the drone program, let me know. I'm around. Okay,
we're going to talk about that. Yep, to be continued.
Whenever you're ready, brother. Well, always, right. Anytime. I'll see you. Thanks, Matt.
All right, thank you.
Guys, if you're in an area where you're trying to get to our classes, but we're not close to you, fret not. We actually have on-demand training at streetcop.com. You can take that course online right now, and then you could attend that training in the future at no additional cost. You can redeem your voucher, so you get 2 for the price of 1. We don't want to deny you the ability to take this training now, especially knowing that it can keep you safe, at a very minimum, putting bad guys in jail where they belong, and at the maximum, going home to your family. Check out streetcop.com for that offer.